Guitar Hero. Immensely popular and successful series that with its fresh and innovative gameplay centered around a unique peripheral captured the hearts of a generation to become the rhythm game a lot of people think of when they think of the genre as a whole. And this, meanwhile, is a controller for GuitatFreaks, a game made a whole 6 years before Guitar Hero was even a thought in someone's mind. Interestingly similar, aren't they? So, how did that happen? That Guitar Hero takes after GuitatFreaks isn't secret special knowledge. The Wikipedia page for Guitar Hero literally says as much within the first paragraph. This is not an expose or a teardown, nothing quite that spicy here, and it would be very untimely if it was, since Guitar Hero is already dead. Plus, I also very much enjoy the Guitar Hero games. They're among my favourite games ever made. I enjoyed them so much, it's probably the reason that my wrist sounds like bubble wrap when I rotate it. But there is still a story to unpack here, and I find even among enthusiasts of the genre there's pretty low understanding of how these two series relate to each other, how much was lifted wholesale, what was changed, and how weird it is that Guitar Hero was even able to exist at all. At most, people tend to look at a few seconds of footage of GuitatFreaks and conclude that these are basically the same thing and think no further on it. I insist on thinking further on it, so let's take this from the top, shall we? It is December 1997. Game developers are figuring out how to use the expanded audio capabilities that being able to put video games on these weird plastic discs called CDs enabled. In this environment, Konami releases Beatmania into the Japanese arcades, and it almost immediately becomes insanely popular. Beatmania was not the very first rhythm game ever. That accolade traditionally seems to be given to 1996 Parappa the Rapper instead, which I've always found really weird as a fact. It's like if the first FPS ever made was Killer 7, you know? But Beatmania was the very first of what we would now consider the traditional vertically scrolling rhythm game. Notes fall down, and when they hit the line, you press the corresponding key. This is so fundamental that it's difficult to conceive of a time where this gameplay would have been considered novel, but being the first of its kind, it turned a lot of heads in the Japanese arcades, being easy to understand and very pick up and play, while being difficult but rewarding to practice and master. It's a kind of game so perfect for the arcades, it's amazing to consider it wasn't a thing before the late 90s. Beatmania is themed around the premise of being a club DJ and sees you pressing one of 5 buttons or turning a disc representing a turntable in time to the music. I don't have access to original arcade cabinets, but fortunately most of the games I'm going to be talking about have fairly accurate console ports, so that's what you're seeing here. Incidentally, to really hammer home what a meteoric success Beatmania was, this console port was the best-selling PS1 game during its weeks of release and would go on to move over 1 million copies, at a time where million selling was bona fide mega-hit numbers. Now you may be wondering what this has to do with guitar gaming, but we're getting there surprisingly soon. As much as this is a YouTuber video essay cliche, it is also meaningful context. So Beatmania launches, does insanely well. Konami has now started a rhythm game boom, which they are super quick to capitalize on. They rename their internal music game division Bimani in honor of the game, and immediately start cranking out new versions of Beatmania as fast as they can, and soon after in 1998, the very next year, they try their hand with a music game themed around dancing, and oh look, that's Dance Dance Revolution, and needless to say, this also does mega hit numbers. DDR probably requires very little introduction, being just about the only other rhythm game besides Guitar Hero I can reliably trust a Western audience to recognize on sight. While Beatmania never really managed to capture an international audience, DDR would go on to carve out a dominating presence even in Western arcades, being much of the Western world's introduction to the traditional vertically scrolling rhythm game instead. Except in this one, the notes scroll up instead of down, and you gotta use your feet to hit panels on the cabinet. So you're Konami, and you're now sitting on 2 mega-hit rhythm games amidst a genre boom you helped create. Except it's actually 3 because Pop & Music released 2 days after DDR did and was successful in its own right and is a game played with this 9-button abomination of a controller, and it doesn't really fit into this video, but I have to at least mention it or some people will get mad at me, and you know, it's not that I don't like Pop, it's just not really relevant to the overall thing. So what do? Settle for 2 popular releases? Branch out into different genres? Sue your competitors to cement your market dominance? Well, no, kinda, and yes, respectively. Wait, what was that last one? While Beatmania and Dance Dance Revolution were proving extremely popular, they were also quite abstract representations of their respective activities. Neither really feels like playing an instrument. Enter 1999's GuitatFreaks, not even a full year after the launch of Dance Dance Revolution, and where things will start to look more familiar to a Guitar Hero enthusiast. Seriously, they were just absolutely hammering these things out so fast back then, it's nuts. Once again, GuitatFreaks had a pretty accurate PS1 port released a staggeringly quick 4 months after its arcade release, and enables me to start talking about the finer points of how GuitatFreaks actually plays and how it's changed over time, especially in relation to its Western counterpart. I hope you didn't think this video was just going to be some gormless twat reciting information you could have googled if you care, like what everyone else does on this website when they talk about these games for some reason. I bought every single console GuitatFreaks game that exists for this video, and by God, I am going to tell you about them. This PS1 port was released exclusively in Japan and has a surprisingly small song list of a mere 18 tracks. This isn't necessarily out of character for initial Drummania releases, as it's largely symptomatic of how fast these games were getting developed at the time, and PS1 CDs didn't have enormous storage capacity in the first place, but still, it's pretty trim. The basic gameplay will naturally be quite familiar to anyone acquainted with Guitar Hero. Notes scroll up, you must hold down the colored fret on the guitar controller, and strum when it crosses the line to hit a note. Indeed, if you are familiar with Guitar Hero, the basic muscle memory will serve you extremely well here. The system is identical. You can continue to hit notes on the same button by simply holding down that button and continuing to strum. Instead of an animated 3D band performance in the background, GuitatFreaks opts for a unique video for each song, and some of them are just plain weird, man. That is me when I am a happy man. The bowling alley when you get a strike be like. If you can tear your eyes away from that, you may also notice every so often this guitar icon scrolls up the field. If you tilt the guitar when it hits the line, you are awarded bonus points. The game kinda hilariously calls this a wailing bonus. This mechanic is almost certainly what inspired the star power system in Guitar Hero, similarly activated by tilting the controller. Another immediately noticeable difference is the presence of accuracy judgments. GuitatFreaks judges based on how accurately your strum timing matches when the note crosses the line. Accuracy judgment is an extremely standard feature of arcade rhythm games, but it's not something the Guitar Hero games ever adopted, which I think reflects the difference in environment these games were designed for. Guitar Hero always targeted a relatively casual market with a greater emphasis on party play. Arcade games are not really like that. You do not gather around the GuitatFreaks cabinet and drink a beer with the lads while warbling along to smoke on the water. They're more, for lack of a better way to describe it, stoic and solitary experiences where the individual sets their own goals, whether that be accuracy, clearing, or just pressing buttons to nice music. Speaking of that music, it's worth noting in this initial entry, GuitatFreaks' tracklist contains 100% original music. This is also in character for Konami's music games. They almost all place a much greater emphasis on their original in-house music, but does present another contrast with Guitar Hero, which had a completely licensed soundtrack instead. Later GuitatFreaks games would start incorporating licenses, but always as a minority of the songs. Now, I am profoundly music game brained, so I have no qualms about playing a game full of songs I don't know, but it's another one of those traits that I suspect limits the game's casual appeal, but we will get back to that. The inherent joy of playing fake plastic guitar is no less present in GuitatFreaks. There's just an inherently satisfying physicality to the game that's obvious even at the novice level of play. That's why it was copied for Guitar Hero, after all. You don't need to be any sort of rhythm game expert to understand why this is fun. Although speaking of physicality, let's discuss the controller itself. First and most obviously, there's only 3 fret buttons compared to Guitar Hero's 5. This is probably the first thing you noticed on the footage, I just decided not to mention it until now. You never need to move your hand up and down the neck, and because of this you might think this would make the game easier and less complex, and not exactly, but more on that later. These early entries are in fact pretty mild difficulty-wise, they get harder as they go. The strum bar is, I would say, a bit mushier than Guitar Hero's equivalent controllers, and due to the increased emphasis on precise timing for your strum, you almost invariably end up really attacking the thing to get your inputs to be crisp. If you watch any high-level GuitatFreaks gameplay online, you will see they almost all adopt this posture where they're just relentlessly beating the crap out of the strum bar, and I also ended up doing this as I got more into it. Especially because I think the controller is annoyingly prone to dropping strum inputs unless you're quite forceful about it. I don't know, maybe that's skill issue on my part. What's not skill issue is the reduced leniency on fretting. In Guitar Hero, when you play single notes like, say, a single red, the game will allow you to hold down either just red or green and red. Guitar Hero will take the lowest fret held as the input when playing single notes, even if multiple are being held. GuitatFreaks does not do this. You need to exactly input a single note. If you're used to lazily holding down chords like I am, this game will ding you for it. I want to mention this bit of UI insanity while I'm here relating to the strum bar, which is that in Guitar Hero, you navigate menus by strumming up and down on the strum bar, and every menu in the game is oriented vertically to accommodate for this. It's a little awkward if you're a lefty like me, since it means the inputs will be backwards, but still, this is a piece of UI design that is otherwise so effortlessly intuitive I just assumed it was stolen from GuitatFreaks, since all the menus here are also oriented vertically. But I found, to my horror, that no, top fret scrolls up, bottom fret scrolls down, start picks an option, and the strum bar and middle fret do absolutely nothing, and this was never ever changed in any of the console versions of these games. It's crazy, dude. They orient the whole game vertically and then don't use the main up and down mechanism on the controller to navigate it. Just absolute bizarro world stuff. I gotta hand the point to the boys at Harmonix for looking at that and picking a much less stupid navigation system. Incidentally, this difference in how the buttons are mapped means that no, you cannot use a Guitar Hero controller to play GuitatFreaks or vice versa. I tried. Anyway, back to the controller. Of note is that it's also much smaller than even the Guitar Hero PS2 controllers, which are themselves pretty dinky relative to the models produced later for the 360 and PS3. I would say it feels like a cheaper piece of kit than any given Guitar Hero controller, even though I don't find it to be a serious impediment to enjoying the game any. I only paid about a tenner for it secondhand, and for that price it is a perfectly acceptable controller that I am happy to own, unlike some other plastic garbage we will get around to discussing later. If I'd paid the 6,000 yen this thing supposedly retailed for back in the day though, I might feel a little more burned. As much as one can when buying over 25-year-old retro games anyway. So that's GuitatFreaks. It's a pretty small game, arguably experimental since Konami was just rapid-fire throwing all sorts of shit at the wall back then, but it represented yet another success for them in the arcades, and so Konami's music game division did what they do best and instantly pumped out a sequel. GuitatFreaks' second mix Append would release in February 2000, ever so slightly under 7 months after the initial entry, and this is a comparatively much more fully featured game, expanding the song list to 45, over double the amount of the first game, and finally including a variety of difficulty modes. That's right, the first GuitatFreaks was so bare that there wasn't really a proper difficulty selection. You could pick either normal or expert, but most songs only showed up on one or the other. Only 2 songs in the whole game had charts for both. Now, the higher 2 difficulties are locked behind a code, which is nevertheless directly provided in the manual anyway, which seems like it defeats the point a little. That's a weirdly common thing with these early rhythm games. They very often lock higher difficulty settings behind some kind of code. Were they afraid of new players picking extreme and getting their ass beat in the arcade and never touching the game again? Possibly. But these home ports being as faithful as they are leads to this slightly awkward arrangement being carried over. Second Mix Append is an interesting release for a few reasons. First and most obviously being that title, Append. What does that mean? It means if you put the game in the console and try to play it, it won't work. You first have to boot up the original game, go to disk change, and then take the game out of the console and put the second mix disc in, and only then will the game boot. This is the only game in this particular series that works this way, but Konami did this with a lot of their other franchises. DDR has a couple, and Beatmania in particular has entirely too many of them. I don't really know what the exact reason for this is. A rumor that's fairly pervasive in English-speaking circles is that it was Konami's attempt to circumvent some kind of limit on game releases imposed by Sony themselves. But I couldn't find a single source to back this up, and I don't think it's true. It's certainly not the case that these games require this to function on a technical level, because ROM edits exist to bypass the disk swap check. What's potentially more relevant is that these Append games were released at about half the price of conventional releases, so my assumption is that it was just a weird business strategy on Konami's part. Probably because, as I've hopefully impressed firmly on your brain by now, Konami was cranking out an absolute ton of rhythm game releases at the time, and they, likely correctly if you ask me, reasoned that they would not be able to sell all of this shit at full price given the rapid release cadence. It wasn't incredibly popular with the players though, since basically every post I could find about this in Japanese typically considered the practice a negative. Another interesting feature is the edit mode, which enables you to create your own charts to the music in-game. DDR games have a similar feature, which you may remember, but GuitatFreaks having it is more noteworthy because the game is key-sounded. What the hell does that mean? Key-sounding means that when you strum your funny little plastic guitar, it'll make the sound of the song that you're playing, the specific note. Wait, doesn't Guitar Hero already do that? See, that's the thing. No. Or, not exactly. Guitar Hero just has the entire guitar audio isolated to its own audio track and mutes it if you miss. So there's no variance in timing if you play early or late or something. The guitar track is either on, or it is off. In GuitatFreaks, if you play late, you will hear the guitar late. If you play the wrong note entirely because you held down the wrong fret, you will hear a wrong note. The game contains the guitar track broken up into small musical samples to facilitate this. This increases the level of immersion and also provides more immediate feedback for how you're playing. In Guitar Hero, it is not necessarily clear if you missed a note because you strummed with bad timing or if you fretted incorrectly. In GuitatFreaks, you can tell those two types of mistakes apart from audio feedback alone. It's cool. All those wrong notes I played made it sound more original. and edit mode lets you play around with these samples, essentially allowing you to create playable remixes. The mode is quite well featured, and someone more creatively inclined than me could probably make something genuinely pleasing to play and listen to. I simply used it to create musical war crimes. This feature sadly never returned in future installments. It's exclusive to the PlayStation 1 games. It's technically unlockable in the first game, but it requires you to clear 500 songs to get it, and that game has 18 songs total, so, no. Nobody is doing that. Why would you even do that? Just get second mix. Speaking of features that never return, there is also high speed mode, which makes the songs play at double the speed. This is real, and you can play it. For a certain value of play anyway, at this speed this is almost totally unworkable, but it's a pretty good bit. So that's the initial GuitatFreaks entries. Relatively small games, but pretty fun ones. According to sales figures provided from Niche Barrier, while GuitatFreaks didn't do the monstrous sales that Beat Mania and Dance Dance Revolution did on the PlayStation, it still did pretty well. As for arcade revenue, there is almost no way to get accurate data for that, but since they kept making them, I'm going to make the fairly basic assumption that it did well enough for Konami. Because let me tell you, Konami made a bunch of stuff that didn't do well, and they dropped all that real fast. But they were not the only people who wanted in on this making guitar games for nerds thing, as Namco would look at GuitatFreaks, do an eyes emoji, and then make the completely insane decision to release 3 guitar peripheral-based arcade games in the tail end of 1999. Guitar Jam, Million Hits, and a third one I'm going to withhold for dramatic effect because I could not believe this when I put all the pieces together. Now you may have noticed that I'm not using any footage of Guitar Jam or Million Hits, and that is not because I'm lazy, it's because Konami sued these games so hard they became lost media. We don't really know anything about them beyond text descriptions. Guitar Jam was apparently much more of a simulator, while Million Hits was updated monthly somehow with the latest chart-topping hits, which sounds very fascinating as an extremely early example of arcade games receiving regular updates. Details are very thin on the ground, since Konami sued Namco on the basis of guitar controller-related patent infringement, because that's a classic bit of game industry shenanigans. Don't like something? Sue it over a vague patent that you probably should never have been granted in the first place and be on your way. Sure would be fucking stupid if that was still happening. Konami did and would continue to do this quite a lot through the years. In fact, here is an incomplete list of rhythm games Konami has attempted to sue for one reason or another. Wait, why is Rock Band on here? We'll get to it. I can't find a result of the lawsuit, but we can pretty safely assume Konami got what they wanted since these games ceased production, and while this I absolutely cannot prove, it is also alleged that Konami would refuse to provide new cabinets or updates to arcades that carried the games, and encouraged arcades to destroy the cabinets if they wanted to continue doing business with Konami. I cannot prove that, but it would present a pretty good reason for why those cabinets are almost impossible to find nowadays. Almost. Because remember that third game? It was Jamalami Now, an arcade port of the PS1 sequel to Parappa the Rapper, co-developed by Namco, because life is real funny sometimes, and this story somehow involves the sequel to the one thing that could claim to predate Konami's music games. Jamalami Now was lost media up until 2023, when a cabinet was found to be in the possession of British celebrity Jonathan Ross of all people, and he very graciously allowed his cabinet to be dumped and the data archived, which is an insane story. You can find more info and videos about Jamalami Now over on the channel of the guy who helped preserve it. It's pretty interesting. It seems extremely likely to me, though I cannot be 100% certain, the reason Jamalami cabinets are so rare was in no small part because of this lawsuit. They were being sued over guitar peripherals after all. Brief intersection with one of the recent success stories in game preservation now over, let us return to Konami, sitting in a dominant position over the Japanese arcade market because they would sue anyone who tried to challenge it. They would thus attempt to expand their domain and branch out into the international market, with Beat Mania, Dance Dance Revolution, and GuitatFreaks all receiving North American releases. Pop & Music, as far as I can tell, they made no attempt ever to get that one out of Japan. Of the 3 releases attempted, only DDR really hung around for the long term, and while it's kind of impossible to state definitively why, I don't think it's a coincidence the one game that really stuck in the global consciousness was the one that centered a lot of its identity around popular licensed music. DDR certainly has original music, but a much greater proportion of its tracklist was licensed, especially in the early days. There's no rule that says that Western audiences cannot take to a rhythm game that features an original soundtrack, and quite a good one at that, but considering having popular licenses was part of the whole reason Guitar Hero blew up the way it did, and it's the main distinguishing element between the game that succeeded in the arcades and the 2 that flopped, it seems fair to single it out as an important factor. Rhythm games based around original soundtracks are a bit of a hard sell to a general audience, even if those original tunes are very good, and there's a huge variety on display here, but it's the kind of thing that wins over the dedicated crowd of core music gamers rather than actively breaking into the mainstream the way Guitar Hero did. We might be living in quite a different timeline if GuitatFreaks caught on in North America, but the games would effectively remain Japan only. However, the console ports would be a niche favourite among import gamers in the States, a fact that would go observed by the then newly established Red Octane, a company who got their start operating an online video game rental service. They would later also gain experience with music game peripherals by producing third-party controllers for DDR, a game that did catch on in the States. A pretty interesting confluence, but I'm getting a little ahead of things here. Snap back to the year 2000. The PlayStation 2 is out and... what is this? That's not a guitar. No, it's the controller for Konami's Drummania, released as a launch title alongside the Japanese PlayStation 2. Yep, we're talking about plastic drums now too, just to really dig into the full scope of what got lifted from Konami's catalogue. While fake drumming wouldn't come to the Western instrument game scene until 2007's Rock Band, Drummania would beat them to the punch a whole 7 years prior, with a game I absolutely fucking hate. On paper, Drummania is a very simple game. You have 5 pads to hit, 2 cymbals, a snare, 2 toms, and a bass pedal, and the game simulates the act of drumming. It's very what you see is what you get here. It's laid out pretty much the exact same way that Guitar Hero World Tour would later arrange its drum simulation, which is probably not a coincidence. The songs are good, once again an all-original track list, but also once again a pretty thin one at 29 songs. Many of them shared with the existing GuitatFreaks games. But this controller, man, it is so bad. It's so bad. For one thing, the pads are tiny and all a part of one solid mass, which makes it very easy to accidentally strike plastic instead of the actual pads, and indeed, during the making of this video, I shattered a drumstick from coming down too hard on the wrong part of the controller. Very cool. Thank you, Konami. The pads being very small also makes it very easy to accidentally bang your sticks together when doing rolls, since you need to operate in a much narrower zone. The pads themselves are also prone to reliability issues. I had numerous issues with dropped inputs and the pads cross-talking when hit. The former appears to be a fairly notorious complaint from the Japanese reviews I read, so I don't even think it's an age thing. I think this controller is just buns. But the worst part has to be this complete embarrassment of a bass pedal. This is a thin piece of foam with a plastic bag attached that they expect you to rest on the floor and use as the bass pedal? It's light, it's flimsy, it's basically guaranteed to fly out from under you while you're playing, and it doesn't even register inputs very consistently. It is completely unusable, not even vaguely fit for purpose, total scam of a peripheral. Awful. And I think they knew it was awful because the game itself contains an option to automatically play the bass notes for you. Like, oh yeah, our controller is trash, let's just slap autoplay in there, that'll do. However, there is something else you can do. For reasons I cannot possibly fathom, if you plug a Rock Band drum pedal to this controller via a 3.5mm to RCA adapter, it'll work. And you can just use that as your bass pedal instead. The Rock Band pedal is a much better piece of kit, so this was the only way I found this controller to be even vaguely usable, replacing bits with a better one. With this change, I went from failing out of almost everything to being able to clear expert charts. The bass pedal was apparently the glue holding my brain's entire sense of timing together. I couldn't even begin to guess at why this works though. I simply do not understand electronics enough to even hazard a guess. Analog inputs are crazy, man, it just works. I still hate this controller and it didn't really salvage the drumming experience for me, but it was an improvement. Drummania itself, as far as the actual game is concerned, is also a bit busted on the mechanical level. There's nothing theoretically wrong with hit drums as accurately as possible, but I always felt like the audio sync was perpetually off for some reason. I always felt like I had to hit slightly earlier than it looked. Ah, no, Punchy, just fix it with offset. Firstly, this game doesn't provide any such options, and secondly, I didn't have the same issue with future Drummania games because spoilers, there are more. It was just this one. I swear I'm not just whiny or experiencing skill issue. It's not me! It's the game! Please believe me! Further compounding this is the fact Drummania appears to have absolutely no late window at all in how it judges timing. If you hit even a little late, you're catching a combo break. Late greats are not a thing. It's either go early or you're not getting that full combo, champ. I hated it. It really chafes against your brain to play slightly offbeat at all times in a rhythm game. Fortunately, these timing issues will be resolved in the next game released later that year, GuitatFreaks' third mix and Drummania second mix, an extremely elegant thing to title your video game. From this point on, the guitar game and the drum game would combine into one entity, the newly christened GitaDora. It's a Japanese portmanteau of guitar and drum, you see. While the cabinets would remain distinct entities in the arcades, the two could be linked together for cooperative play, being essentially two halves of the same game, and this setup has persisted to this very day. However, since Drummania popped into existence slightly later than GuitatFreaks did, the console ports where both games are included have this very awkward non-matching numbering going on. The drumming more or less feels like it works properly in this game, so that's nice. Doesn't save the peripheral from being dog water though. By this point I'd given up and was playing the game with a standard DualShock. The button bindings are surprisingly intuitive. Anything new on the guitar side? Bass guitar. A whole 8 years before Guitar Hero World Tour would finally let you play bass outside of a co-op setting. That's just lovely. Also, they made it completely impossible to see what the hell you're doing. Oh. Well, that's a bit less lovely. Yeah, I can't really understand what happened here, but they made it so that the slight beams of light that show up when you hold down a guitar fret are blindingly bright in this one. So bright they obscure the incoming notes and make it incredibly difficult to see what the hell you're doing. Awesome. So guitar is mostly not very playable in this entry. This change would be immediately reverted in the next entry, GuitatFreaks 4th and Drummania 3rd, released in 2001. So guitar is playable once again, and I can now actually see what I'm doing, playing bass for the very first time. But since it's apparently impossible to just score a straight win during this run of games, amazingly, drums broke again, and this time in a really fatal way. There's some kind of error with the way this one processes repeated inputs on the drums, and it was extremely prone to just having the drum controller stop accepting inputs entirely for a split second. Like, beyond the norm of the controller just being bad at bassline. I had this happen on stream, and I thought it was just the controller dying because, you know, it's a piece of shit, but no, this one's a software problem. It was so bad that Konami actually issued corrected discs, and you can distinguish corrected versions by a little dot on the spine. I didn't know this when I bought this game, so you'll never guess, I have a bugged version. Don't you miss the days when games shipped bug-free and without glaring fatal issues? What simpler times they were! Getting mad at games this old feels like trying to redeem an expired coupon. You can bin out on this drum controller bollocks though, since this game has the extremely novel feature of supporting actual MIDI drum kits as a controller. Namely the Yamaha DTX series, which the arcade cabinets were clearly based on. I can't speak to how well this works personally, I really did think about it, but my house is full of enough plastic junk as it is, I couldn't justify buying an entire drum kit for stupid PS2 games. Especially because I'm not sure about the compatibility, I'm not really liquid enough to be throwing several £100 at e-kits that may or may not work. But you know, if you'd like to help me indulge that and you're enjoying the video so far, Patreon is in the description. Hey, help a brother out, you know what I'm— This game also introduces the Encore stage, an even more bonus stage that you can only get to if you perform well enough on the Extra stage, where you are made to play the song Daydream. And oh boy, Daydream is worth talking about all by itself for how obscenely difficult it is, especially by the standards of the time. I'm just going to show you the drum chart to this for a moment. It's just so much, man. For one, this song has the annoying time signature of 17 by 16. The cymbal roll by itself is a speed high enough that most people just won't have the raw ability to tackle it, but then the syncopated snare hits and bass kicks throw an almost impossible curveball. Not to mention just how goddamn tiring this is to do. If you manage to handle this well for 2 minutes, you also have to contend with these weird rolls at the end that fluctuate in speed just to throw off your timing further. It's the stuff of nightmares. This is so outrageously hard that it took 8 years before anyone ever managed to achieve a full combo on it, with the most common strategy being this completely insane technique of holding 2 sticks to hit the cymbal with. A more avant-garde technique involves holding the stick backwards and doing this ridiculous-looking rebound thing. This is apparently called a gravity blast by actual drummers. It is a real technique, and that is actually what it is called because drummers are having way more fun with their instrument than anyone else is. The guitar side is absolutely no slouch either, with high-speed strumming that took an absolutely whopping 22 years before anyone ever produced a perfect result. 22 years for someone to conquer this. Not to participate in macho gamer, my game is harder than your game shenanigans, but Through the Fire and Flames was defeated in a little under a year after Guitar Hero 3 came out, and that's pretty formidable. If it takes dedicated rhythm gamers more than a few weeks to crack something, you're dealing with some serious business. This took over 2 decades. I've scarcely heard of anything like it in the genre. Also, the video that plays is terrifying. This is an actual fever dream. Bear in mind, this song debuted in the year 2000 in the arcades. At the time, the strongest boss songs in other games would have been stuff like this in DDR. Barely even anything by modern standards. Rhythm games have a tendency to get harder with successive entries as the player base's skills improve and the developers create more daring challenges. But GitaDora was pushing a level of difficulty that was far, far beyond the standards of its time. It was so notorious that the composer, Mutsuhiko Izumi, apologized for making it too hard in the soundtrack liner notes. I'm pretty sure this apology was jocular, but the fact it had such a reputation says it all. Now, at this point, the console GitaDora games would go on hiatus, and it would be the only Bimani series to do this. Beatmania, DDR, and Pop & Music all would continue to pump out entries completely unfazed, but GitaDora halted. As for why? Maybe they weren't selling as well. Maybe it's because they put out 2 games with glaring technical issues back to back and all the problems and angry customer complaints that come with that. Probably some combination of the two. The arcade version, however, continued to do great business, with Konami pumping out a new installment roughly once every 6 months, but I'm not going to cover all of these individually because I don't have access to every version ever produced and it's not really important to our story. What is important is that for the time being, on console, GitaDora was out of action, which means I can skip forward about 4 years to 2005. Which is an important year since it's when Guitar Hero started existing. Yeah, remember when this video was about that? Now, I'm not going to go into the entire development history of Guitar Hero itself, because there are plenty of YouTube videos already about that, and in fact the game contains its own making of video as an unlockable extra, so you could also just play it. But the short version is that American video game company Red Octane took note of the popularity of GuitatFreaks. The story's been told a few different ways over the years, but the basic gist is that at first they tried to partner with Konami directly to bring the GuitatFreaks games overseas, but then eventually decided to partner with Harmonix to produce an original game instead, prototyping the then fledgling Guitar Hero games with GuitatFreaks controllers. It's not 100% clear why they went the direction they did. Konami may very well have simply declined their partnership, or Red Octane may have instead considered that it would be more lucrative to have an original IP they had more of a piece of, instead of being reliant on Konami. I could believe either, and it's probably a combination of the two. So Guitar Hero releases, and it immediately lights the Western gaming world on fire, garnering smash critical acclaim and selling about 1.5 million copies over the next couple years. But you already knew that, because knowing that is likely a prerequisite for having clicked on this video. What I find more interesting about Guitar Hero as a release, given all we know of what came before, is a simple question, and one I've never really heard anyone else ask before. Why didn't Konami sue? Hopefully I've established by now that if you made a game that looked even kind of similar to a thing Konami was doing, it was pretty likely you were going to eat a patent lawsuit. But Guitar Hero, despite its immense popularity and it having literally been prototyped with GuitatFreaks controllers according to this Engineering.com article, didn't attract Konami's scrutiny. I couldn't find any record of litigation relating to the franchise, at least with regards to controller patents. Guitar Hero seemed to attract basically every other kind of lawsuit, but I'm gonna gloss over that for now. Epic fail? Is this really how reporting was in 2009? Jesus Christ. In fact, the only controller-related lawsuit I could find was this pretty hilarious 2006 one where Activision, who at this point owned Guitar Hero, tried suing a company that made third-party GuitatFreaks controllers, only to get countersued with their legal argument basically boiling down to the absolute cheek of this bitch. They settled. Is it perhaps that by adding 2 extra buttons and the rest of the mechanical differences it made them legally in the clear? Well, no, not at all. We know this wasn't the case because Guitar Hero 3 specifically includes a Konami credit, because by that point Activision had begun paying them for their patents. So we know Konami got in touch at some point. We also know the style wasn't clear because, as I mentioned earlier, Konami did sue Harmonix over Rock Band, specifically for controller patent reasons, and the two eventually settled in some unspecified way. This is absolutely pure speculation, since there's basically no way for me to prove a negative here. Without a direct statement from Konami, there's no way to know why they didn't do something. It'd be really nice if I did have an answer, because it'd make the video a lot neater, but some things we just cannot know. I can't help but wonder if they took a more uncharacteristically opportunistic outlook on the success of Guitar Hero, and rather than trying to shut it down, instead settled behind the scenes for getting a piece of the pie with every entry on patent licensing. Red Octane was acquired by Activision very soon after the release of Guitar Hero 1, and maybe they thought trying to take a large Western publisher to court was too much hassle when they could instead get paid without all that fuss. One does note almost all of their other targets for international lawsuits were smaller operations. A funny, if probably wrong, guess as to why they didn't sue Guitar Hero is that they might have been too busy suing In the Groove at the time, since legal proceedings regarding that were going on at pretty much the exact same time Guitar Hero came out, a game which did not manage to get away with fairly blatantly ripping Konami off in the same way Guitar Hero did, because it turns out if you make enough money, you can largely pay your way through this problem. Rest in peace, In the Groove. Whatever the case, despite everything, despite the risk, despite the very present threat of a lawsuit, Guitar Hero beat the odds and became a sensation. Good for it. But let's forget about all that and jump back to Japan, where Guitar Hero 1 and 2 didn't release at all, because shortly after the Western release of Guitar Hero, Konami would revive the console ports of the GitaDora games with the V series of games. Did the success of Guitar Hero compel Konami to start releasing home versions again? Probably not, I think it was just a coincidence. This is a set of 5 games released over about a year and a half. 3 numbered V games that are ports of a corresponding arcade release, and Masterpiece Silver and Gold, which are best of releases that consist of tracks from the arcade games that didn't get specific ports over the 4-year hiatus the series took from console releases. I'm going to talk about these 5 games as a set, which might seem a little strange, but at this point in time, the formula of classic GitaDora has more or less crystallized, and the systems and structure of all these games are nearly identical. The main differences between individual games is track listing and unlock system. So what's new? Not a lot that sounds incredibly exciting on paper, but these are also simultaneously the best set of games due to the accumulation of lots of small, polished changes over the years of arcade releases. UI is easier to navigate, you can set more granular options like being able to flip the playing field upside down, which I'm slightly embarrassed to admit made a huge difference to my play because I do have terminal Guitar Hero brain and never really got used to the notes scrolling upwards. The difficulty of a particular song is now shown as a number on a scale of 1 to 99, making it easier to tell at a glance how hard something actually is before you jump in and eat shit. Open pick mode has been added, which throws in the addition of the open note, which has to be hit with no buttons held on the controller, complicating inputs a little bit more. Weirdly, this is segregated into its own entire game mode that you have to specifically opt into, they're not just sprinkled into normal guitar charts. I guess they were afraid of upsetting people with a brand new input type? We've also got an unlock system now, since these games come packed with a big enough song list that they don't make all of it available by default. These are pretty standard. When you complete a playthrough of arcade mode, you make some progress towards a new unlock. Play more, unlock songs. Simple. I would, however, like to single out Masterpiece Silver and whine about how it has the worst one of these by far. You got this grid, you see. Complete a playthrough, flip over a certain number of panels. Flip over all the panels, you get a song. Isn't that nice? You got the song. However, it is perfectly possible for the markers to land on panels you've already flipped over, which makes the unlocking process effectively completely random. Will it take you 20 minutes to unlock a song, or 3 hours? Let me consult my crystal ball, because ain't no way of telling. You will waste countless credits on having none of your markers hit anything, and boy does this get annoying. It took me about 40 hours to fully unlock this game, and I resent it for having the best song list paired with the worst unlock system. It's a cruel joke played on me and me specifically. I am redeeming my expired coupon right now to complain about this. I cannot stress, I have to go off script to complain about this. 40 hours! What the fuck, man? This is a crime against rhythm games, and someone should answer for it. They fixed it in the next game so the markers only land on unrevealed tiles. Yay! But they added way more unlocks so it still takes forever. No. But it still feels better, I suppose, so yay! I don't even know what I'm mad about anymore, let's move on. Since all of these games are largely systemically interchangeable at this juncture, I'd like to take this time instead to talk about the finer points of their mechanics and how that relates to the chart design, especially in comparison to Guitar Hero since these games existed contemporaneously with it. I haven't really delved into this super deeply up to this point, partly because I'm afraid of overwhelming people with nerd rhythm gamer bullshit, but also because the V games collectively have a lot of meat on their bones. The earlier games are thinner and trend easier overall, Daydream notwithstanding, which means there's less useful examples to draw from, but by the time of these games, there'd been a lot of time for GitaDora to develop a distinct gameplay identity and catch up to a smoother difficulty curve. I had a pretty tough time writing this because this is a type of analysis that basically doesn't exist on gaming YouTube. You know, you got people making fucking 20-minute videos about how Mario jumps, but you cannot find jack on this entire website about how to arrange notes in a pleasing fashion in one of these stupid Simon Says games for man-children. So here's my attempt. If you made it this far, I assume you're up for some nerd shit, so welcome to the advanced section of the video. Okay, we're not starting off that advanced, because I'm starting with the baby-level observation that one of these games has 3 buttons and the other has 5. We've been over this, but the immediate instinct of almost everyone is to assume fewer buttons means less complexity, but I would like to challenge this assumption a little, because GuitatFreaks is still plenty difficult, I assure you. But also, it's not completely wrong. It's a fairly well-established trend in rhythm games that the more inputs you have to worry about, the harder it tends to be. This is especially visible in any game with multiple options for button count, like DJ Max or Easy 2 On. The 8 key modes are considered much more difficult compared to 4 key. Indeed, Guitar Hero with its 5 buttons places a much greater emphasis on the physical dexterity of the fretting hand, since it will ask you to move up and down the fretboard to hit various patterns, at least in difficulties where all 5 frets are being used. GuitatFreaks cannot really do this, opting to instead emphasize the precision aspects of play with its accuracy judgments and the difficulty of staying on beat with your strumming even when rapidly alternating frets. Something further de-emphasized in Guitar Hero due to a mechanic present in that game that GuitatFreaks entirely lacks: the hammer-on and pull-off. Now, the fact that GuitatFreaks doesn't have these is such a fundamental difference in the way these games play that it's kinda crazy I haven't mentioned it until now, but I really wanted to save it for the analysis bit, because it has an extremely outsized impact on the charting style. In Guitar Hero, notes that are close together will typically have this lighter coloring on them, indicating they are a hammer-on. These notes can be hit after a successfully strummed note by simply pressing the corresponding button, but do not need to be strummed a second time. This is where Guitar Hero departs massively from the feeling of realism and leans more into the fantasy, because with this mechanic it puts a massive emphasis on the ability to quickly glide up and down the fretboard, giving you the feeling of being a cool elite guitar player who effortlessly rattles off a complicated guitar solo if you take time to achieve fluency with this system. It's fun, but it's also a departure from the nature of the activity it's imitating, because I don't know if you need me to tell you this, but playing the guitar doesn't work anything like that. Like, okay, tapping and hammer-ons are a thing you can do on a real guitar, I know, but it doesn't work like this. You can't keep producing sound if your strumming hand is just doing nothing for several seconds like it does in Guitar Hero. You gotta keep the strings vibrating in order to produce noise. That's just the physics of string instruments. GuitatFreaks lacks this mechanic entirely. Every note must be strummed, and it will keep you very honest at that due to the strictness in timing. Consequently, the emphasis is placed away from raw dexterity with one hand and more on the coordination between both of your hands. In this way, GuitatFreaks stays truer to the activity on which it is based, and can similarly create the feeling of satisfaction when you rattle away at the strum bar and your fingers snap across the frets with perfect timing to complete a tricky solo. To be clear, I'm not positioning either as superior. More realism is not inherently good or bad. I'm just illustrating that the divergent approaches taken by these games to mechanically evoke the fantasy of playing the guitar end up emphasizing different physical elements of play. Guitar Hero is not particularly interested in emphasizing this strict coordination for the most part, on purpose. For instance, here's something you might not have known. Guitar Hero has fairly generous leeway on the relationship between fretting and strumming. It is possible to strum before you've held down a fret, then start holding the fret, and the game will declare that good enough and will give you the hit as long as they were approximately close enough together. This window is wider than you'd probably expect, and most Guitar Hero players will end up subconsciously relying on it whether they realize it or not. It makes fast strumming that alternates across frets notably more challenging to execute in GuitatFreaks, and a lot of former Guitar Hero players who try GuitatFreaks crash out on patterns they feel they should be able to hit with ease, and it feels wrong to them. It puts them off the game. It certainly did for me. Like many others whose only experience was Guitar Hero, I simply dismissed GuitatFreaks as feeling weird. It's only when I revisited the game with substantially more genre experience under my belt that I was able to evaluate it for what it actually is rather than the one thing I was expecting it to be. And look, fellow Guitar Hero players, Clone Hero players, we need to collectively admit something, alright? You and me. Now, there's no shame in it, but GuitatFreaks exposes a truth about us as a player base. We cannot do accuracy for shit, man. We're out here playing Clone Hero and riding that early hit window like underwear 2 sizes too small buried deep in our collective ass cracks. GuitatFreaks is a real wake-up call that we're not as clean as we've been led to believe. If you're able to calmly pick your knickers out of your butt and admit that your fundamentals aren't as solid as a game made to be deliberately permissive of sloppy inputs has led you to believe, you can find a rewarding and engaging experience in GuitatFreaks. Also, go wash your underwear, you gross little man. What was I saying again? Right, realism. So, Guitar Hero de-emphasizes realism in its input mechanism, but realism is emphasized in that game. It just manifests in the charting rather than the input. In Guitar Hero, there is a very strong correlation between the way notes are represented on the playfield and the notes actually being played on the instrument. Punchy, what the hell does that mean? Okay, I'm not a musically trained type of guy, so bear with me as some of this sounds kinda strange, but it means that, when a particular note or chord is in the song, it will be consistently represented with the same fret that you, the player, have to press. It's not a 100% always thing, but Harmonix were generally very attentive to this. Not only do those games like consistency in note correspondence in a single song, there's a strong consistency in how it represents common melodic structures. Arpeggios, triplets, trills, and grace notes will be charted in a relatively similar way across multiple different songs. Charting is often conducted relative to pitch, with higher pitch notes often finding themselves further down the fretboard. This enhances the feeling of playing the music in a way that GuitatFreaks primarily relies on its key sounding to instill in you, and also conveys the feeling of learning an instrument as you become more used to the building blocks of the music as you play through a setlist that escalates in complexity in linear order, gradually layering on these patterns in more complex ways or at higher speeds. It tries to get you to think about the game in a way that's intuitive even to novice rhythm gamers, and the approach was evidently extremely successful. This is not that different from level design in, say, a platformer. Rhythm game chart design is a kind of level design, it's just one that's gotten a whole lot less formal exploration in game critique. By contrast, GuitatFreaks showcases a much lower level of correspondence between the actual notes in the song and the frets you must hold in order to play them. Not none, mind you, but owing to its fewer buttons, it has to cram a wide musical range into a smaller space, which can cause the chords played to feel quite arbitrary, if not almost random. Arpeggios often don't cleanly sweep across the fretboard, instead going back and forth. When it does, it's usually reserved for the highest level charts, since it's extremely difficult to input in a system where you must strum every individual note correctly. You don't see these kinds of weird rapid chord swaps in Guitar Hero charting because music isn't generally played this way. This might sound like a condemnation of the GuitatFreaks style so far, but as an approach it has distinct strengths and weaknesses. Consider this chart for Timepiece Phase 2's bass guitar for a moment. Notice how the actual note being played in the song on the actual bass guitar is only changing maybe once every measure at most, usually every 2, but in the gameplay, the fret the player is having to hold is alternating every 2 notes, much more rapid. In this example, the easier difficulties actually correspond closer to the real music being played. You may look at this and decry it as making the chart arbitrarily more difficult to play, and yeah, it is. GuitatFreaks is very willing to correlate things loosely in pursuit of patterns that are more physically interesting to play, which is likely to harshly chafe the sensibilities of anyone coming in from Guitar Hero, but it has strengths of its own. Stronger pattern variety is chief among them. The game's willingness to chart things in unusual or arbitrary ways results in it testing elements of your coordination in ways that Guitar Hero very rarely does. Bass guitar is perhaps the perfect example of this as a whole. As the Guitar Hero and Rock Band games added bass guitar, many of those charts are extremely fucking boring and monotonous to play in this context because of those games' unwillingness to break from the musical correspondence in the name of more interesting charting. Since bass lines are a part of the foundation of the music in rock, they tend to be less intricate. I know, not always, there are please do not leave an angry comment if you play bass guitar in real life. But this manifests in frequently dull gameplay in Guitar Hero. And I think even Guitar Hero's developers were aware of this, since when World Tour was released, they fairly blatantly stole the open note from GuitatFreaks and made it exclusive to bass in an effort to give bass charting its own unique spice. But it didn't really work out in practice because the open notes don't slot neatly into Guitar Hero's more musically accurate charting style. Is an open note the high end of the scale or the low end? Who knows? Sometimes it's both. It didn't really click with people, and bass remained unpopular. GuitatFreaks doesn't really have this issue, since it's all a lot more arbitrary to begin with. Bass charts can stay interesting alongside regular guitar, and open notes are a fun way to add a little more input complexity to the game. It's also worth observing how these approaches are partially born out of the game's respective playing environments. Guitar Hero is a console game with a linear career mode, so it can afford to be more meticulous in how it arranges notes since it knows the order the player will experience them in. GuitatFreaks is an arcade game, where the entire song list is available to anyone from the moment they put a coin in the cabinet. They need to ensure that every song has interesting, well-balanced patterns to play to keep people coming back putting coins in the machine to see it all. I'm not sure GuitatFreaks achieves the well-balanced part that well due to the extremely bizarre decision of older GuitatFreaks games shown in this video to have every difficulty level have the same number of notes, with the only thing that changes being the complexity of how they're arranged. But look, I never said it was a perfect game. Just that it's too easy to automatically dismiss what actually does make it unique for not being exactly like the Guitar Hero we all love and are familiar with. In the end, I don't think either approach has an innate superiority over the other. They're simply different games that take different approaches to roughly similar but not identical goals. I like Guitar Hero for how it satisfies the fantasy of feeling like I could be a really cool guitar-playing virtuoso if I could stop making too long internet essays about video games for 5 seconds. But I also like GuitatFreaks for reasons you can't really get out of Guitar Hero. The excellent original music, the more thorough test of coordination and timing, and the pattern variety that Guitar Hero can occasionally lack. Both games present valid and interesting answers to the question of how to make fake plastic guitar fun. And one of the joys of exposing yourself to a variety of rhythm games is seeing those differences. And I hope you get something out of this segment, because I find rhythm games are a poorly understood genre even among the more serious analytical types, with many people unable to articulate the difference or simply dismiss all games in the genre as playing similar because they're all about hitting buttons when they cross a line. There's honestly still so much more to be said on this topic, and it's tempting to do so, because unless some other person who fancies themselves a critic suddenly has a rhythm game phase, this might be the most sincere attempt you're going to get on this platform. But I'll leave it there for now, since we still have a timeline to wrap up. Hopefully I've given you something to think about here. Rhythm games are cool. It's interesting to see how different games attempt to achieve similar goals. And so, with the release of GuitatFreaks and Drummania V3 in 2007, ever so slightly before Guitar Hero 3 came out and did genuine mega hit numbers, the GitaDora series console ports came to an end. GitaDora would never officially reach Western shores on console, and even if it did, Guitar Hero held that niche too strongly by now. Konami made an ill-fated and embarrassing attempt to break in with 2008's Rock Revolution, a game that was widely panned as a cheap imitator, which had to have been pretty galling to be labelled as a cheap imitator of a gameplay style you technically invented, but the criticisms were nevertheless well-founded, and Rock Revolution passed without much fanfare. It's a sad ending for the progenitor of the guitar game, except for the fact it's actually still around to this day and Guitar Hero is dead. So what happened there? In the intervening decade or so that Guitar Hero spent embodying the path of the true rock star by engaging in unhealthy indulgences that ultimately resulted in death, which I'm not going to get into here, there are like 24 videos on this platform about that already, GitaDora played the long game with that steady stream of arcade releases, continuing on a path largely never deviated from since the series' inception. Since Guitar Hero conversely never really made an impact in Japan, GitaDora could continue unchallenged in its arcade market, with only a brief attempt by Guitar Hero to break into that market in 2009, a project which Konami is explicitly credited on as a collaborator, so I don't think they were worried. I can't actually find if this cabinet even showed up in Japan, it might be a purely Western release. In 2010, they'd even steal from Guitar Hero by releasing GitaDora XG, a new cabinet model that came with a new guitar controller, one that, interestingly, now had 5 buttons, so GuitatFreaks could get in on that pitch-relative charting action, ooh la la. Drummania incidentally added an extra pedal, cymbal, and tom, and this is just basically regular drumming at this point. Like, it's a pretty basic kit, but it's still a complete E-kit. I think if you memorized any given master chart in this game, you could probably just play the song for real. This game is for sickos. Nowadays, you can even find some of these cabinets in America. If you happen to live near a Round 1, you might be able to find a cabinet with the latest version of these games on them. And if you don't, there's a modern PC version of the game that is still supported with updates to this very day as of the time of uploading. I'd love to round off this video with a positive conclusion and recommend this if I'd managed to pique your interest in the series, but this isn't the most accessible release for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, this is not a normal video game release, you can't get it on Steam or some such. You have to go through Konami's web portal, account, and payment system, and it sucks so bad. It sucks for me, and I can actually read Japanese. I wouldn't even know where to begin with trying to explain this shit to someone who doesn't. It isn't region-locked exactly, but they absolutely do not make it easy for anyone outside of Japan to play it. Konami's got a history of that kind of thing. Secondly, the game requires a monthly subscription fee to play, and not a super cheap one at that. The spectre of live service comes for everything you love. All of Konami's arcade rhythm games nowadays have a corresponding PC version with their own individual subscriptions, so I hope you don't play more than one of these if you like having money. This presents a pretty substantial barrier to entry, and lays bare that these releases are more for already extremely invested players than providing a good on-ramp for people new to the game who don't have access to an arcade cabinet. It's a shame it's kind of hard to recommend for logistical reasons, since otherwise they present an extremely robust way to play the arcade game at home provided you have the equipment. And if you already have some sort of clone hero set up, you do. Any 5-button guitar that works on PC will do fine. Do not ask me about drums, I don't know what the hell you do with this, I think you basically just need to own an actual E-kit. It feels like something of a missed opportunity to me because this is so very close but yet so far from filling a niche that clearly still exists in the West for guitar games, since the community has kept the Guitar Hero games alive with Clone Hero and full-scale mods like World Tour Definitive Edition for a solid decade and change after the series completely stopped producing new entries. But Konami isn't interested in producing normal releases of these games, and I can kind of understand why. After all, it does seem to be working out for them, and the logistics of arcade game development is completely unknown to me, so I couldn't even guess at the financial incentives at play here. Meanwhile, Guitar Hero is dead, so who really got the last laugh here? Imitators are temporary. GitaDora is eternal. For the more casual among us who just enjoyed hanging out in a living room with friends and warbling along to classic rock ballads, you're gonna have to keep an old console handy because I don't think we're getting that moment in time back ever again. GitaDora wouldn't fill that niche even if it was more accessible. But if you're one of the hardcore devouts of the plastic instrument, really starved for new guitar games and are willing to solve the riddles 3 in order to play it, there is stuff out there for you. I guess there's also Fortnite. These are your options. Either you perform the ancient rituals to access the forbidden knowledge necessary to play a Japanese arcade game on your computer, or you play Fortnite. Both of these options will give you some type of brain damage, and it's up to you to pick one. There is no third option. Pick now, cretin. Decide your personality forever because this is all we have left in this cursed genre. Your childhood will never return and this is all that remains. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you made it this far, I assume you liked it, so consider dropping a subscribe. I'll be making more videos soon about interesting video games. And consider supporting on the Patreon, because it funds relatively indulgent videos like this. I would also like to apologize for how abrupt the ending of this video was. It already didn't really have an ending, but I had a closing gag based around the fact that the modern version of GitaDora has a bespoke cover of Megalovania in it. But it turns out you absolutely cannot use Megalovania, even a bespoke cover, in a YouTube video because the people who own the distribution copyright, Materia Collective, are absolutely desperate greedy bastards. And they would claim the entire video if I did, so I simply removed the gag. I'm editing this on 4 hours of sleep. I can't be bothered to come up with a new one. It's really funny. This entire video, obviously, I had to work around YouTube Content ID quite harshly because of the nature of rhythm games, and the one thing I got dinged for was a video game song. Funny that. I'm gonna stop yapping about this now because this topic gets me really heated. Music industry people deserve the worst in life. Thank you very much for watching. Fuck Materia Collective. Ta-ta for now. Bye-bye.